All right. Good morning, everyone. There's such a robust discussion going on already in the room. I'm reluctant to break it up, but we do need to finish the conference at some point today. So this morning we're beginning with a session where we've invited a set of private sector economists and analysts to talk to us about the same topic, monetary policy and inflation targeting. I have to say, they don't need to be nervous in any way, but they are all slightly nervous. And part of the reason for that is because there's a bit of role reversal here. It's usually myself or the governor or other MPC members who are on the receiving end of questions, often which we struggle to answer. So this time around we get to ask a few questions which I know they've thought a lot about, so I'm very confident they will have no problem giving us their insights and their perspectives on. I'm not going to read off their bank affiliations. Most of you will know what they are. This is not meant to be a kind of let's hear the house view from Bank X. It's meant to hear the wisdom of this group of economists who have been dealing with the South African economy for a long time and are very well respected here and abroad. So it's Razia Khan, Maketi Lejane, Elna Moolman, and Andrea Mazia. And we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to ask them a few questions and hear their views. I'll pose one question, and then each of you can respond. And then we will open up to the audience for further questions a bit later on. So let me start with an easy one. You all speak to a lot of investors locally and abroad all the time about the South African economy and its policy choices that are made here. What would you say are the main investors' views and concerns about monetary policy? I mean, how do they think about it? What do they think are the highlights? What do they think are the kind of low points of what we do? What can you tell us about the conversations that you have with those investors? Razia?
So about monetary policy, I would say probably very few concerns. The one thing that does stand out is that the SARB has a well-established reputation for the credibility of its monetary policy amongst EM central banks. This is very well recognized by investors. The kind of cyclical concerns that do come up are really related to fiscal policy. How much is this going to create different stresses in the system? How much does it get in the way of what investors otherwise expect the SARB to be doing? There is a perception that the SARB can always be relied on to be hawkish, one way or the other, and perhaps this really stands in contrast to a lot of the other EM peers where central banks are not regarded in quite the same way. There's a lot of focus, understandably, on whether there's going to be a lowering of the inflation target. And I'm sure this will be no surprise to anyone, but the question keeps coming up. Is the SARB really targeting 3% already? And should we be understanding current monetary policy decisions in light of that?
Great. Thanks, Razia. Maketi?
I don't think there's a ton more that I can add related to what Razia's added. It echoes my feelings as well. Central bank is highly, highly regarded. Everybody sees it as the sort of like the bastion of macroeconomic stability in South Africa. Has done a really good job of setting the risks that are coming from the fiscal side. Is the impression that investors have. But like I said, like Razia said, the present moment is really about their target. What is the SARB really targeting? When is a decision going to be made one way or the other around the inflation target? How much appetite is there, especially from National Treasury, for lowering that inflation target, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where guys are concentrating. But I do think it's also important to bring into the discussion that there is a little bit of a view, I think, developing that the SARB can be overly hawkish So the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some people think it's a fantastic thing, most bond investors. On the equity side, guys are take a much dimmer view of that sort of positioning.
Elna, you're shaking your head yes. So what is it about our communication that comes across around this? I mean, are we not communicating in the right kind of way, or is it too much balance towards certain factors and not others? I mean, we always get accused of, being too focused on the global environment. I'm not sure that's true, but it'd be interesting to hear if you would agree with that and you hear that kind of.
I think there was a lot of conversation yesterday, of course, about how do you communicate when you're outside the target range. But at this stage, I think what's very important is how you communicate if you keep rates on hold while you're forecasting, like the market, that you're going to meet your target, you have a small negative output gap, you have restrictive monetary policy if you compare us relative to neutral. So I think that's part of where the focus is right now, is how do you justify that? I think in the last monetary policy statement, the addition of the detailed scenarios helped a lot. So to my mind, you've put a very plausible scenario and you've quantified that in that scenario it could add 1 percentage point to inflation, and then you can't really be faulted for keeping rates on hold. But I do think how you take this forward and your actions from here and how you communicate it, if you remain on hold without the risks playing out, will become important. There's definitely a question among investors of, is the SARB already starting to target something lower? And like I say, I think for now, you've justified your actions, but how you take this forward will be important in that regard.
Okay. Very uncertain global environment, for sure. Andrea, what's your take?
Yeah, I'm getting away and stepping back from, maybe the last decision, just more conceptually. I do think the SARB is highly regarded, so I'm going to sort of support what Razia was saying earlier. It is seen as generally a pretty orthodox inflation targeter in our region. So I think that's certainly a point that we can make quite strongly and with confidence. The comments we also come across from particularly offshore investors is the level of access that people get to the SARB is very unusual, specifically in an EM context. And I am going to continue using the word EM today. But in an EM context, the SARB does provide higher levels of access than is usual. And I think that speaks to the kind of transparency and credibility that it has very specifically tried to adopt in its communication strategy. In terms of, I think, examples of how well regarded the SARB has been, I mean, just have a look at the experience with the transition to the new monetary policy implementation framework. For an emerging market to come out and say that we're going to go from a shortage-based system to a system where we're going to flood the market with liquidity, and for investors to take this quite well, and for markets to respond quite well, and for the transition to be as smooth as it has been, I think that tells you something about the respect and the faith that markets have in the bank. Another example was JFECRA, the level of communication and openness and access that we as market participants had to specific members at the SARB, very senior members of the SARB, with regards to that JFECRA reform, I think was very encouraging and very comforting. Lastly, I would say, if you were to split them out, and I think Mama Kete touched on this, if you were to split this out between equity investors and fixed income investors, I think fixed income investors think, the SARB is great, wonderful, doing a great job. We understand the reaction function. It's all about just, calling the next move. But in general, no criticisms. Equity investors always want rates lower. Like, it doesn't matter, rates must be lower. And that's a frustration, and that's sometimes something that I have to, personally have to spend more time, explaining, the intuition behind decisions, the risks, etc. So there is this dichotomy between how the SARB is perceived depending on the asset class that you're speaking to. And perhaps that's something that happens in many other places, but it's certainly what I find in South Africa.
Great, thanks. So Equity investors are problem children. We get that. Okay, so 4.5% is the midpoint of the target, and inflation expectations have gradually moved down to that level. Just reducing this a little bit, if that is our actual policy target, right? We want to see inflation expectations sitting at 4.5% over the medium term. It seems like we're kind of getting this right, okay? So there's a lot of uncertainty, but policy settings have achieved that kind of outcome. So how much weight do we put on being overly hawkish, Mamaketi? I mean, where does that come in? Where does that feature? Is it a communication issue, or is it just, as you've all said, that there are structural features of the financial markets that are always looking for lower rates because it floats stock prices? How do we view this? How should we be viewing this?
I was just having a conversation with the governor, actually, where he says the problem with financial markets analysts is that sometimes we're supposed to say what the SARB is going to do, but we want to overlay with that what we think the SARB should do. So it's kind of like sometimes it's what we think they should do, sometimes it's what we think they will do. So I think when the situation is evolving, and that's been very much a feature of the current moment, where you look at where inflation is coming out, where growth is coming out. I mean, those are the headline kind of indicators that you're looking at. And you're saying how is policy or the policy orientation or policy indications from the MPC changing relative to what is happening to the target levels, et cetera. And then you have a situation like we've had in the past year where inflation expectations have basically come down a lot. Growth has come in below expectations consistently, but the monetary policy stance in the short and in terms of as much as you can read the forward guidance hasn't shifted. The question is, what is it that drives monetary policy then? So I think there's also, the way the SARB talks about risks, which I think has been the case for the longest time, where there's a weight attached to upside risk to inflation that seems to be quite a bit higher. So there's an asymmetry when you think about risks. So upside risks are given a much bigger weight than downside risk, and the discussion of risk is always feels like it's one way. So, and that is, I think, a consistent feature of the SARB beyond even just now. So there's that. There seems to be a bias in the communication. There seems to be a bias in the communication around risk. There seems to be a lack of responsiveness, at least now, to low inflation. So there are the risk scenarios, etc. But there's never an MPC without a risk scenario. And right now, if one looks out for the next year with the administration that we have in DC, it's quite plausible that this is just going to be a permanent feature, is risks. So to what extent are we going to weigh those against actual economic outcomes? So I think it changes. It's very nuanced. It's very subjective. And it'll depend on the moment. But for the time being, it does feel like the SARB is very hawkish.
Okay. Ellen?
I would say that if I run a couple of Taylor rules using various weights, etc., the SARB has generally followed that. And so I think that would support the idea that actually the SARB's actions is consistent with what it is supposed to do. So perhaps it is just that focus. It might also be the case that the SARB's, of course, primary focus is on inflation, whereas at this stage we feel that you have dealt with the inflation issue, you have it under control. We're very concerned about growth, and that probably comes into the equity investors as well. And so perhaps from that perspective, the feeling is, like Mamoketi says, there's all these risks, but perhaps you do have space to provide a little bit of support for the growth, which is currently perhaps the biggest concern.
Okay. Drea, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm going to bring AI into this.
AI. Okay.
So we can run kind of natural language type processing models to systematically measure sentiment in statements. And yes, over time, the SARB is generally on the hawkish side of such models. Maybe that's what's necessary. That's maybe how you successfully anchored expectations at 4.5. And maybe that is how you are seemingly continuing to do this. And maybe this is what's going to be behind getting expectations even lower from here. That, this notion of overestimate or overreacting to upside shocks and discounting or looking through downside shocks, that's exactly what Claudio Borio was arguing for yesterday. So maybe that's not such a bad thing, and it kind of speaks to this kind of opportunistic disinflation that we came across yesterday. So, from my perspective, that's fairly typical.
Great.
Maybe, Chris, just to pick up a few of the threads here, and I wonder if there's a slight difference in perception between local investors and international investors. I do speak mainly with fixed income investors, but it's very rare that anyone thinks that the tightest stance of monetary policy or the credibility of monetary policy is in any way holding back growth in South Africa. On an international comparison, it's well recognized that there are emerging markets that are able to grow faster for a whole host of reasons. I can't think of an instance where any investor has suggested to me that the long-standing structural issues impeding growth in South Africa in any way compare with the cyclical stance of the central bank when it comes to monetary policy. So it's really interesting for me to pick up on all the commentary that people do think that the SARB can sometimes be too hawkish. It's unlikely that many international investors are making that connection between the monetary policy stance and growth outcomes.
Great.
Can I make
Go ahead.
some response to that? So I think it's a very marginal debate, right? So firstly, all of the international investors recognize it's more about the reforms and how much does Operation Vulindlela achieve and all the rigidities, etc. So there's no doubt about what's more important in holding back growth. But I do think there is a marginal debate. I was in the UK on a roadshow the week before the MPC meeting. There was not a single investor who didn't say to me, they think the SARB should cut, SARB is not likely to cut. But again, it's a very marginal, could we have had another 25 basis points? It's not going to change the growth trajectory dramatically, but if your growth last year was only 0.6, their argument is just take the 0.1 if you can get it.
Okay, let's various things one could say about all this, but let's move on to what really ought to be the meat of the discussion, which is reflecting on what you heard yesterday, right? So there's a whole series of presentations about what inflation targeting and monetary policy ought to do, what the experiences have been around the world, and then a really interesting session in the afternoon talking specifically about South Africa, and I want to get into that a little bit more with you. So, at the core of much of what was said was a set of ideas around price formation in the South African economy exhibiting problematic tendencies, right? Whether it's coming out of the labor market or administered prices, broadly defined as a public finance tax on the economy. How do you think about the price determination issues? I mean, do you think that this is a binding constraint on monetary policy? Do you think it gives rise to something like a natural rate of inflation that South Africa can't do anything about? Or do you think these are things that are open for various kinds of reforms and that something like a more specific target can actually do something about?
So I think there's a difference, most likely, between South Africa's early experience as an inflation targeter and the situation that we see in place now. There is recognition that the structural settings of the economy didn't necessarily lend themselves to the easy achievement of an inflation target, especially earlier on, where a lot had to be done just to prove that a lower inflation outcome was even within reach for an economy like South Africa. When it comes to the wage setting in the economy, I think it's very difficult to step back from what is motivating some of those wage demands. The background of the inequality, the need to try to do something to address that, that has been a key factor in wage demands the whole way through. And it's a question as to how quickly that's going to fade. Then everyone will be familiar with the fact that there are the structural issues that have lent themselves to administered price inflation being as high as it's been. There is an expectation that with reforms, maybe we're now finally in sight of better outcomes, more benign outcomes. But nobody looking at South Africa's economy is able to look at all these various elements that determine where inflation outcomes are going to be. And it's very difficult to step back from that structural backdrop.
Thank you. Okay.
So the way I think about this is to say there is a problem with administered price inflation, right? So if you look at electricity, which has been the biggest of all of them in the past 10 years or so, it's not clear to me that moving the inflation target 1.5 percentage points changes what Eskom is going to charge. I mean, you're talking about 13% versus 4%. It's that difference between the inflation and where Eskom tariffs settle is always going to be there. So I'm not sure that that is necessarily the key constraint that one should because you still want the whatever the inflation index part of the Eskom tariff is to adjust lower, and it would still adjust lower if the inflation target or the overall inflation in the system adjusted lower. There's the other side of it, which is imported inflation, which is influenced by the rand, etc. And that part of it, the imported inflation should benefit lower if the inflation target was set lower. So I get that in the short term, you can look at the administered price basket and say if Eskom or municipalities are charging 10% or whatever the case may be, then your sacrifice ratio is higher if you were to take the inflation target lower. But I do think it's a once-off cost, and it doesn't really. Those inefficiencies are those inefficiencies. They're still going to push through into pricing in real terms. But what you're trying to deal with is the nominal aspect of that adjustment. So I get the whole administered price inflation story around price formation, but I also think a big part of our price pressures are either endogenous because of dollar rand, fuel, food, all of these things that are not administered in any way, and that would benefit from a lower target.
I think there are a couple of things that can help with these rigidities, right? So Razia referred to the reform process that's ongoing. Electricity, we think, is probably another 5 years of double-digit increases. So it's a process of getting to more cost-reflective tariffs. But if you think about logistics, for example, if we write that we get implementation of the private sector concessions in 2 years' time, that could, for many companies, make a massive difference. There are companies for which logistical costs are up to 50% of their total input costs. So if we get that right, that can already have a big impact. But there are other things as well. If we look at the literature over the last 15 years on wage formation, for example, one of the proposals was always the visa regime and importing skills. So in our experience, this trusted employer scheme is making a massive difference. I've spoken to some consultants in that industry implementing it, and they say they can now handle the paperwork of importing a skilled individual in 2 weeks, which used to be 9 to 12 months. Now we're at the beginning of that. They promised me data on exactly what the uptake has been so far, but that is the kind of intervention that I think could ultimately make a difference on wages. I think the governor gave a couple of presentations in 2016 talking about the structure of our collective bargaining. Again, that's something that we could potentially address, where the argument is if it's at a very high level macro, then you're big enough to influence the wages, but you also feel directly any negative consequence if it's not set at the correct level. If it's at a very micro firm level, again, you feel that direct impact if it's set at an incorrect level. Ours is just at the wrong space where you have this negative impact, you don't feel all of the negative consequences thereof. And so, again, that's something that we could do something about. These marginal changes in the last labour legislation to exempt very small new companies, for example, from the collective bargaining process. But there's definitely something else that we can do that could have an impact. So if the change in the target is implemented over a long time, there's definitely some of these rigidities that we can address.
Andrea, before you come in, I mean, two things that have struck me in recent years. One is just simply that there seems to be a lot more responsiveness to economic activity coming out of wage determination in the private sector. And then as part of the fiscal consolidation plan, you've had a dampening down of public sector wages. So the labor market it seems very different today than it was prior to the pandemic. And then the other point about the admin prices that I worry a little bit about is that, I agree with you about the cost-reflective, issue, particularly in energy. But if you look at Transnet, a large part of Transnet's pricing is actually wages, right? So these are wages that are being pushed through in a monopoly sector that are generating what we call an administered prices problem, but in many ways it's just a wage problem centralized in that particular sector. So if you were to reform that sector, you might get better outcomes. But that's my parenthetical comment on that. And let's move to...
Can I just ask
ahead.
another question? If you look at wage setting, it doesn't appear to me that for the time being, unit labor costs are a problem for inflation.
Right.
Actually, they don't seem to have been for a minute. So if you then think about that, I think we're so used to thinking about wages as being a problem in this economy, but that's actually not been the case. And there might actually be an argument to be made that there is slack in the labor market at the moment, because our unemployment hasn't really recovered post-COVID. And then the other thing is around electricity prices as well. I suspect what we will see is that electricity costs in the economy are not going to just be, they're blend between renewables and Eskom. So the actual price pressures that are coming through from power is going to collapse relative to what we see at a headline level. So that constraint that you've removed from electricity from 23, for example, where electricity costs actually were above what the Eskom level was because people had to generate in other ways, now that turns into slack in electricity so that the blended cost is going to be quite a bit lower. So I actually think electricity is going to be disinflationary going forward. And probably has started to be, it's just that it's not maybe coming through in the numbers. So I don't think that, which has been such a big part of the inflation problem that we've had, is going to be a problem going forward, actually.
Let's hope you're right. Andrea, go for it.
Look, I think it's appealing to just focus on supply shocks as drivers of inflation, but I think there's a fair amount of kind of structural models out there and evidence to suggest that demand plays a role as well. And so particularly, for example, coming out of COVID, you had this massive kind of stimulus, both monetary and fiscal, South Africa as well as global, that has been shown to be an important driver of the inflation cycle, right? Those demand shocks. So, as much as we want to focus on electricity and municipal costs, etc., there's a demand component which I think just basically reaffirms the role of monetary policy in the discussion, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, there is this issue about, in South Africa at least, price dispersion, and that is creating a problem around structurally higher inflation, so something needs to be done about price dispersion, and I guess, to some extent, administered prices is a driver of that, to some extent. I think there was an amazing period between 2010 and 2017 where administered prices, excluding fuel, and this is the important part, administered prices, excluding fuel, came down quite beautifully, right? From 11% to about 6%. And then around the middle of 2017, they've just gone sideways. They have not responded. What we need to do is to figure out exactly what led to this beautiful disinflation in administered prices in that period and replicate it going forward. This is going to be the key to making a new inflation target, a presumably lower target, more achievable. And you can do the maths. You can do, if you say, this admin prices X fuel has averaged whatever it has. Incidentally, it's 6.5%. What does the private sector inflation rate then need to be in order to give you the total blended number of 3? And the answer is the total private sector inflation rate needs to be around about 2.8, 2.9. That is assuming a zero response from administered prices. If administered prices could even come in 1% lower, they don't have to be at 3, just 1% lower, then you ease the burden on the private sector, and the private sector can generate maybe, or at least live with, a little bit more than 2.8, which incidentally, getting back to the equity discussion, 2.8% CPI is seen as unsustainably low. We spoke yesterday about greasing the wheels, and this is why central banks favor positive inflation rates. Yes, there is an argument to be made, particularly amongst corporates, that some inflation is a good thing. So I think we should be wary about, not aiming too low. We'll get to that in a moment, I guess. The last point I'll just make is this issue around the SARB credibility and its ability to maybe withstand supply shocks, seeing as that's what we're kind of talking about. I mean, in my mind, it's really it's a trade-off between credibility and flexibility. Right? So if you're credible, then you have that flexibility to look through supply shocks. And so it's that kind of trade-off that I think is relevant for the central bank discussion. And I guess it is what makes EM interesting, right? Because many EM central banks don't have that flexibility. I think the SARB does. So, just some comments.
Maybe if I can, Chris, just
Sure.
to pick up a few points that we've heard from both Mamokete and Andrea that I thought were interesting. On the administered price inflation outlook, I don't think it's so much about looking in the rearview mirror and saying, did South Africa get something more right over that period from 2017? What struck me was the point Mamokete made about electricity, the deregulation that we've seen in that sector, the dismantling essentially of a monopoly, and the extent to which that should lend itself to perhaps weaker price increases, weaker tariff increases in the future. And maybe that's what the game changer is. Maybe it's about greater deregulation, more competition in this space. Maybe that's what finally breaks the back of the administered price inflation.
A good question. So I'm just, Andrea, I want to come back to you on this point about credibility and flexibility. I mean, if you're an emerging market and you're hit by serial supply shocks and you don't respond to them, presumably you have no credibility, right? So we all want to look through supply shocks. That's what flexible inflation targeting is meant to do. But we all know that if we systematically do that and the inflation rate goes up, then we have no credibility. So there's a kind of, I think, a game that you have to play as a central bank and I think we try to do this, about analyzing what these supply shocks are, identifying the ones that we think are going to translate into longer term inflation, and then trying to respond to that. So you look through what you can, but what you can't, because it's going to carry through, you have to respond to. This question about reform, I mean, it came up very strongly yesterday, this kind of implicitly this issue of, well, if you want to lower the inflation target, do you need to do a whole bunch of reforms that validate it first, or can you put the monetary policy reform on the table and then sort of use that as the anchor to get all the other bits and pieces to fall into line? How do you think about that challenge, that problem? Let's start with Andrea first. Go start at that end.
Yes, I've said this before. It's reform season, and
It's reform season.
and reforms are better when they're coordinated. But I don't think I personally am not convinced with the argument that you need the fiscal anchor first. I think monetary policy can lead. It certainly was. The target was successfully lowered in 2017. Where we were kind of reeling around discussions around fiscal unsustainability and that. And I think it went off pretty well. So look, I'm not convinced that fiscal policy needs to be completely resolved, and clarity is needed before monetary policy can move. But just some notes that I'd kind of try to jot down was to think about this interaction between fiscal and monetary policy. And I think, in the past we would like to think of them as kind of substitutes, or in terms of substitutability. I think there's far more to be gained in terms of upside if the two were to be more complementary. After all, these objectives are explicitly interlinked. You have fiscal determinancy or fiscal sustainability as a determinant of financial stability. And financial stability is an explicit objective of monetary policy. Right? So the two go hand in hand. Coordination strengthens credibility, it doesn't weaken it. Right? So I think that's important. I think in practice, what does that mean? Look, I think for a central bank, the central bank needs to understand and appreciate its impact on things like inflation expectations, growth, and the yield curve. From a fiscal perspective, the fiscal authority needs to understand and be committed to debt sustainability, which in effect would compress the yield, the risk premium, and in that way lower R star endogenously. Right? In both instances, you're having policy buffers being rebuilt. Right? So this kind of makes it tangible in terms of how these two blocks fit together. I think they can move independently. I don't necessarily think they have to be completely coordinated in terms of when the reform happens. But I think ultimately they are self-reinforcing and they do work well together. So I would like to see, if we do go on the inflation target, that we ultimately do at some point do something around a fiscal anchor.
Ola?
I think that can happen simultaneously. I think that one of the key takeaways from yesterday's discussions was Stephen Hall's suggestion that any lowering of the target happens over a relatively long time. He talked on stage about 3 to 4 years. In the paper itself, he talks about 5+ years. If you have a 5-year period over which you change your inflation target, it has a couple of advantages. One is you can make a lot of progress with these other reforms, not only on the fiscal side, but more on these other things that I've talked about that I think will make a big difference in terms of the output cost of lowering this. I also think that in our models, inflation expectations are absolutely critical in determining the output cost of lowering the inflation target. So again, if you have more time to bring inflation expectations down, I think that ultimately your output cost could be a lot lower. And I think there is so much uncertainty about that, what that output cost is, that if we can do all of these things to ensure that we have the minimum possible output cost, we should take that. So to my mind, just give yourself enough time, and then you can do it all of, simultaneously. You don't,
Can I ask you a specific question, right? Because one of the things that didn't come up yesterday very strongly was the exchange rate channel. And when you say, drag this out as long as possible to minimize the output cost, won't that minimize the positive benefits of the exchange rate channel? I mean, I would have thought that you make an announcement, you've got a lot of credibility up front. The exchange rate ends up doing a lot of the work for you very quickly. So if you water that down, you're actually going to increase the output costs, not minimize them. Now, obviously, my implicit assumption here is that an exchange rate appreciation is going to be good for growth in the short and medium run, which we can argue about. But if that were true, so would that change your view of this or not really?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I think the other factors just weigh a little bit more, that okay. You can then, all of the objections that there could possibly be against lowering the inflation target, you can address if you just have a little bit of time and then that commitment.
Okay, great. Katie?
Maybe a very controversial point on this, or a somewhat controversial point.
If you're going to be controversial, you can jump in. Go for it.
3% is still part of 3 to 6%, and I think the beauty of how this has been communicated in South Africa so far is that a lot of international investors are under no illusion that the SARB sees the benefits of lower inflation if 3% is achievable. Even if 4.5% is the midpoint of the target, investors are thinking, well, South Africa's ultimately looking to get to 3%. just because of the communication around this. And to your point about the exchange rate channel, it's no bad thing. Why has the rand been, in relative terms, as resilient as it has been to all of the shocks that we've seen year to date? One theory is that it's that very strong anchor of credible monetary policy that has brought about this result. So the good news is, I think the benefits are already being seen and hopefully just get stronger over time.
Ketty, your opportunity to be equally controversial.
I'm not a controversial person.
Please do.
So I think if you're going to lower the target, we're talking about 1.5 percentage points here. This is it's not like 3, 4, whatever. If you're going to lower the inflation target, you make it explicit upfront that this is what you're doing. Because the minute you do that, the market starts to adjust for that. And the longer you drag it out, so I'm a little bit different to Elna here. The longer you're going to drag it out, you don't get the benefit of having a lower target, because that benefit then gets you quicker to the lower target. It suggests that you compress the period over which you're going to have to keep real rates high in order to get the lower target, and then you can release the system much quicker. So whereas if you do it slower, it takes a longer time. So the market, for example, is not going to give you the benefit of 3% if you say, oh, we're first moving to 4. Then you're not going to get the full benefit of that 4 anyway. Maybe you get 10 basis points for every 50. So you're not really getting that benefit. Whereas if you come and you say, we're moving the inflation target 150 basis points, maybe you get a 50 basis points up front on cost of debt, on credibility on dollar rand. Dollar rand compresses, it gives you a little bit of inflation room, so you get real rates higher quicker, and then the period over which you can then take rates on the front end lower to reflect that low inflation target is pulled forward a little bit. So for me, I think you kind of do it sooner rather than later. And on the whole, policy balance story, I think you also take advantage of whatever it is that is happening in the system. So, for example, we've already spoken about just freeing up the binding constraint of electricity. That should be disinflationary. It gives you some room to get some growth without necessarily seeing that inflation uptick. And then you can take a little bit of a cost there as well, and then you just take advantage of that gap, and then you take inflation lower. So I was actually seeing this in my head is, let's say we're not talking about the inflation target, say all else being equal as far as the Reserve Bank is concerned. You have more electricity in the system, you have labor market slack, you could ostensibly see the actual level of inflation go down. Nothing else is happening in the system. And in that environment, then the sub's job could be to say, oh, well, this is where inflation is, this is where the target is. So that is why all the sort of like growth reforms, I think, are critically important for creating the environment to get inflation lower and to get the target lower. But I do think if you're going to do it, just do it. If you're not doing it, don't do it. But this whole, oh, we're softly going to, and I'm like, you can't target 3% without saying you're targeting 3%. It's just going to make it unnecessarily expensive.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that?
Please. Go ahead.
So I'm going to agree with half of the Standard Bank team on this. And that is,
which half?
So I'm going to go with, you go cold turkey. All right? And for two simple reasons, really. The first one is, there's no guarantee that the political principles and the political will are going to continue to support your phased approach over 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. What happens if there's a recession? What happens if there's some kind of shock? You're halfway through this process and then the phone call comes into the governor's office and says, right, it's done, the target stays here where it is. So take the goodwill, take the green light, and go cold turkey straight away. You can then have a discussion about how quickly do you want to achieve 3%. But in principle, the target is clear, right? Because there's no guarantee that the political cover exists over a multi-year period. The second point is the basic tenet of inflation targeting is communication and clarity of message. You can't tell people The target is 4.5 this year, 4 next year, 3.5 the year after, 3 the year after. That's what Brazil tries to do, and it doesn't work. Just be clear straight away what the target is. 3% is the number, and we can then have a discussion about how quickly you want to get there. And I think from an implementation perspective, or from a practical perspective, the way you would sort of judge the success is in what direction of travel is the end point of the forecast. If for as long as the end point of the forecast is coming down incrementally and making its way towards 3, you don't have to hike rates. The problem is that if your target's 3 and the end point is 4.5 and rising, then you've got a problem. But if it's 4.5 one meeting and then it's 4.2 the next meeting and 4.1 the next meeting, that's okay. You've got the credibility. You communicate that you're patient and the adjustment is happening and there's no need to hike rates while this adjustment is happening.
I just want to, I'm sure the governor took copious notes when you were speaking about that. I want to take one step backward to fiscal policy. And just, I think we would all observe that there's a lot of concern in the public about the fiscal position. How much should it weigh on how we think about monetary policy? I mean, obviously, something that looks like a consolidation on monetary policy or tighter monetary policy will be revenue negative, but this is clearly a short-term view. How do you contrast that to the longer-term benefits to the economy? Are there longer-term benefits? The governor talked about the debt structure yesterday. How would you, in an ideal world, how would you say to the South African public, look, there are short-term issues, including in the fiscal space, but the longer-term benefits are much larger, or is that not how you would view this? Do you think that there's a growth benefit from getting much lower inflation rate that offsets whatever fiscal growth you think you're getting?
You're saying, are there longer-term benefits of the... I think that was one of the gaps in the literature is trying to quantify that. So there's a lot of literature talking about the shorter-term cost and the sacrifice ratios, and they have their own shortcomings. But I think that if there is any attempt to sell a lower inflation target, that is precisely something that needs to be done. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think if we can have any kind of estimate of the benefits and how long it takes to materialize, it's an easier conversation, because so far the conversation is just about, rates will have to probably stay higher than they would have been otherwise. And so the focus is very much on the short term. So I do think that's a gap in the literature that needs to be addressed if we're moving in this direction.
Is it a gap in the public debate as well? Is what I'm kind of trying to steer you towards. I mean, do you find it frustrating that it's a very short-term focus? Whenever these issues arise, there's always an article or several articles in the paper saying, this is a terrible idea. Is that right?
I think it's easier for this type of audience to appreciate that there will be these longer-term benefits, to understand your exchange rate channel, to believe in the longer-term benefits. It's harder for someone else. And I'm thinking about Treasury's position as well, where they would also have to sell this to a more political audience. Mm-hmm. And I think if one can have any kind of quantification, it just makes it easier, even if the quantification isn't perfect.
Okay, so just at a high level, rolling over the 7-8 trillion rands worth of debt over 10 years, you would rather do that at an 8% 10-year bond rather than 11, 12%?
I wouldn't. I'm just saying
Okay.
it's not an easy conversation to have, and the more ammunition you have, the easier you're going to make it for yourself.
Right. Thanks,
I think
Alma.
to Elna's point, to
Go
many of us in this room, that seems like such a simple point. If you get the monetary policy credibility, if there's a belief in lower inflation, the refinancing of all of that debt becomes a lot easier.
Yeah.
The question is, why is this narrative nowhere in the public discourse? Why do you just not get people talking about this great potential advantage of really getting inflation down to much lower levels, where instead of just spending on debt service costs, instead of worrying about how to deal with the approaching hump in redemptions, it all becomes a lot easier. And this creates the resources for growth. It creates the resources for everything else that could happen with positive effects in the economy. All you really need.
I think maybe how we could make this more understandable or like relevant is on this topic. I think the governor touched on it in his speech to Stellenbosch University last year. And even Don Con was making the point at dinner the other night, is that people hate inflation. Right? So this exercise about how long does it take for prices to double? You know, at a 2% inflation rate, it takes X number of years. At a 3%, it takes Y. At a 4.5%, it takes Z. And I think if you can make it kind of more tangible in that way, or at least more understandable at a very basic level, that achieving low inflation is a good thing, and that's what we should be striving for, then perhaps you'll get the buy-in, right? But I think, you know, to talk about sacrifice ratios and minimizing welfare functions or maximizing welfare functions, it's like it's completely over people's head, right?
We're going to come to the sacrifice ratios right just now, but okay, so it's bring it down to more fundamental issues around how inflation impacts on households. Mama Ketty?
So I'm not 100% sure that the people within the fiscal system, people at National Treasury, appreciate the point that we're making, quite the way we're making it. There was a point made yesterday by him, and he used to work at Treasury.
Don't point fingers. It's all right.
I'm not pointing fingers. That only the SARB lives in the real world. Fiscal authority live
Roy,
in the nominal world. It was Roy.
Right.
And I've heard similar types of sentiments being expressed by people that work a lot in fiscal policy. And so I'm not sure that, you know, even it's a foregone conclusion that we all here see this issue the same. And I suppose it depends on where people sit within the system as well, where people that are more debt managers might be better able, because they deal with issuance on an ongoing basis, refinancing, inflation-linked bonds, etc. So they look at that debt portfolio. But that doesn't necessarily mean that message is consistent across the board. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's not just lay people who struggle to internalize this point.
All right. Okay. So one takeaway I had yesterday is that we should stop talking about sacrifice ratios at all, right? Because we can't measure them, and when we do measure them, we measure them very badly anyway. Will you also commit to doing that in future?
No.
When you write your analyst reports, you'll say the sacrifice ratio is
Let me tell you what my
meaningless?
problem with this is, right?
Okay, please.
I totally understand why 3% is better than 10% inflation. Totally. I understand why 3% is better than 6%. But how do you explain to a person why that 1.5 percentage point matters? So I could almost say to sell 3% when you were targeting 6% would have been an easier sell. But so all this trouble for 1.5 percentage points. And I think it's hard to say, what is the gain of moving 150 basis points really? Versus, so, and I think this is the question I asked yesterday around, we agree lower inflation is better than higher inflation. But lower inflation versus lower inflation, that is more difficult, I think, to sort of, so we're not talking about the sacrifices, like what are we getting out of this?
Perhaps one way to look at that argument is the South African economy has not been able to deliver particularly remarkable growth for anyone. It stands apart in the EM and frontier world because of its much weaker structural growth rate. If at least you can have that combined with a lower inflation rate, there's less of a welfare loss for everyone year after year. It doesn't mean that there won't be growth opportunities in the future, but it's worth pursuing for its own benefit, that lower inflation rate. I think the problem with the narrative is people haven't really been sensitized to the dangers of higher inflation because they haven't seen things tipping the wrong way in this economy. Compare South Africa to many emerging markets, to many frontier markets where there's a much more serious issue with inflation. People recognize the dangers of inflation very clearly in those economies. The difficulty is South Africans have almost taken for granted the price stability that they have had, to the extent that maybe they're not properly sensitized to how it could be even better with lower inflation.
Andrea, Elna, do you want to weigh in
So
on
that's
this?
why I said earlier we need to quantify this. You need to be able to talk about more tangibly what the benefits are, how long it takes to see those benefits. I just think it makes it easier to sell the change in policy to various audiences. And it's not that hard. I mean, your exchange rate channel, that was something that literature focused on a lot in the 2000s, right? And there was a lot done at the time. So there's no reason why we can't just revive that and think about that as an important factor now as part of the communication of why we need to do this.
Longer term growth? You don't think you get stronger, longer term growth with lower inflation?
Again, you don't need to convince me, but you need to convince a
I'm
range
not sure,
of
Elna. I think I do
politicians.
need to convince you.
I just think the
Teasing.
more you can quantify or put something concrete on the table, the easier it is for people to understand and relate to that and just think about that. Like you say, maybe people haven't thought about it that much. It's not undoable. It will just make your job easier.
What about this argument that, for your average household, the fact that you've got inflation over whatever, 4-6% means that you have to think about it on a daily basis? I mean, there's a lot of energy that goes into the collective bargaining system, for instance, to deal with that problem. Wouldn't we all be better off if we could just get rid of it and have an inflation rate of 2%?
Rationally inattentive.
Rationally inattentive, right.
Given how much pushback there is to the idea of just a simple 0.5 percentage point VAT increase in this economy, maybe what needs to be explained to the general population is that inflation is also a tax. How high do you want it?
Right.
Why expend so much energy pushing back on this potentially fiscally stabilizing VAT increase when you're willing to accept that much higher tax of inflation at 4.5%? It makes very little sense.
Okay. Let's do one last question, and then we'll open it up for the rest of the crowd here to ask you questions. I want to come back to this sort of time frame issue. So, ideally, if we were to set the target today, when would we want to hit it, given the inflation trajectory that we see at the moment? Have we passed the opportunity, or does it not matter? We just say 2 years, 3 years. What's the optimal time frame for you, Andrea?
Look, I mean, I don't think we should be trying to game the system here. We're talking about a monetary policy reform that is being taken on the basis of long-term benefits, right? So yeah, there might be times where it's opportune and it makes it a bit easier, but really, I mean, I don't think that needs to be the basis for the decision. I think what we need to appreciate is that there is quite a vast literature on why a lower rate of inflation is better for welfare. Literature that includes things like sticky prices and zero lower bound and positive trend rates of inflation, most importantly. That kind of literature in a model that represents or looks like some of the South African kind of parameters, that kind of literature would point towards an optimal target of somewhere between 2 and 4. So I think that's how we need to think about it, right? Is to recognize that there is, as a starting point, a literature that puts the range at 2 to 4. And it's not enough to simply say, well, our trade partners are at 2 or 3, so we should be at 2 or 3. That's not enough. There needs to be more detailed work than that. And the detailed work still comes out at somewhere around 2 to 4. So for me, that's the kind of starting point. It's less relevant about when you decide to do this. The point is it needs to be done. I asked yesterday about asymmetric costs of choosing too low a target versus maybe a target that is not ambitious enough. And some of that work, that structural work, particularly there's work by Jordi Gali on the US and Europe. There's some early work coming through from Hilton Hollander on South Africa using these types of welfare models. That work suggests that too low a target is worse than choosing too high a target. So when we have this discussion, yes, let's recognize that 2 to 4 is optimal, but let's also appreciate that if we go too low, that is going to be more detrimental. So, I don't know. I don't know if the answer is 3 or 3.5 or 4. I don't know. But I know it's probably sitting somewhere between 2 and 4. So, yeah, I mean, in principle, I don't think we should be too concerned about when is the appropriate time. I mean, obviously, it would be nice for this kind of thing to happen at the start of a fiscal year. So, budget 2025, 26 makes a lot of sense. Maybe you want to start it at the start of a calendar year, right? In which case, November MPC. But yeah.
We'll take the suggestion. Elmo.
In terms of implementation framework, timing, 5 years. Because I think that all of these other adjustments that can take place, your output cost, and I've been very specific not to talk about the sacrifice ratio, but the output cost, I think is going to be a lot lower if you just phase it in over.
So you want to see some reforms happen before?
Yes.
Amaketi?
So for me, I actually don't care when you do it. Just when you do it, you do it.
Just do it.
When you do it, do it. And the thing about it, right, it doesn't matter where you are in the inflation cycle. You say, this is the target. Nobody's going to expect that inflation is going to be there tomorrow. We just have an understanding that the SARB's response function is now responsive to 3 versus 4.5. So whenever you do it, and then you communicate around it. And I think you've been pretty good at communicating around your decisions, even when I don't agree with them, but anyway. But you're good at communicating, and people understand that there is credibility in your messaging. So whenever you do it. But I think if you're going to do it, so this idea that the market currently has that there is a stealth targeting of 3, I think that would be not very great. So if you're going to do it, you say you're going to do it, and you say I'm doing it from this day onwards, whenever that is.
Okay. The current inflation is what, 3.5% roughly? So we could actually get to 3 tomorrow. Yeah. By your recommendation. Razia?
So the political economy arguments that push back against this seem to be that South Africa's economy is still weak. Growth last year was 0.6%, even weaker than it was in 2023, however that happened. And maybe you need a little bit of a growth trajectory, some recovery in growth before you can push a lower inflation target onto anyone. I think that's a very flawed argument because it just goes with the traditional idea that you give up something significant with growth to get the lower inflation target. I think a better communication strategy would be lower inflation is good for everyone. Take that and higher growth. And I lean to what Mamakete has said, just announce it soon.
Good, all right.
I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth.
I think
I'm more ambivalent than
I
that.
think she wants it announced today. So, no, teasing you. Okay, let's open it up for questions from the audience. Thank you very much for putting up with me. Let's start with JF, and then I don't know this gentleman's name in the back, and then David. Oh, there's lots of hands. Let's one at a time. JF.
Thank you to the panelists. Andrea, you were mentioning about how a way to sell a low inflation target is to indicate how quickly prices double, and because people are sensitive to the fact that things do become expensive, and they don't like that. I'm wondering, and I'd like the opinion of the panel on the exchange rate aspect. You know, maybe not so much with the working classes, but the middle classes, lower to upper middle classes, might be more sensitive to that idea that when you have high inflation, the rand depreciates. This idea that the rand used to be a part of the dollar, say the older people, and then this idea that the rand constantly depreciates can't be that great, you know, for confidence into the currency. And a lot of people see the currency as a bit of a benchmark for the health of the country. Can't you sort of like sell that argument that if inflation is stable at a lower level, similar to EMPs and not that far from advanced economies, then the rand is not necessarily a one-way bet over the long run. Obviously, you also need growth. But if you were to get this idea maybe into the mind of more people that the rand has, as I say, more upside as well as downside, maybe that encourages people to save more, and that creates more pool of savings for investment by SMEs in particular, rather than a situation where people might say, well, I might as well spend, you know, because what's my rands going to be worth in 10 years' time? Probably not much. For a long time, among the South African middle class, I got that perception.
Thanks. Let's take the next question here. Yes?
Hi. My name is Andreas. I'm a fixed income portfolio manager at Airbax Investments. One key issue that I feel is missing from the conference discussion on lowering or potentially lowering the inflation target is the impact on South Africa's long-dated fixed-rate public debt. South Africa has one of the largest or longest term structure of fixed-rate local currency debt among emerging markets, making the cost of reducing inflation significantly higher here than in countries with shorter debt maturities. Since the debt is denominated in nominal terms, lowering inflation increases its real value, making it more expensive to service. Modeling reveals if you assume a 2% real growth rate for the economy and reducing inflation from 4.5% to rather 3% raises the real value of just the outstanding stock of South African government bonds, the fixed rate stock alone, by about 6 percentage points of GDP over until it matures. So that's around 450 billion in today's terms is the extra cost, and that increases the Treasury's real debt burden at a time when it's already struggling to contain the debt to GDP ratio and manage debt servicing costs. A higher real debt burden could also raise the country's risk premium, in fact, potentially pushing up real interest rates and further increasing borrowing costs. If the market believes it's becoming more unsustainable, you could see a further steepening of the yield curve and higher risk premiums, in fact. So I think there's been a lot of focus here on how lower inflation is good because it reduces costs. It reduces, prices go down, but it also lowers, of course, the nominal level of GDP and therefore shrinking government revenues in nominal terms. So that is the flip side of it. And while lower inflation may reduce certain nominal expenses, it also leads to lower tax revenue.
Sorry, is there a question here?
Yes.
Please.
It's a long, I apologize for the long statement, but I feel it's really important to quantify this cost and to make sure that it's part of the discussion, because we focus on the benefits, but we are in a precarious position with containing public debt. So 6% of debt of increase in the value of the debt, is that worth it? Is that do we have a benefit to offset that? Thank you.
Great question. Let's go to David first. We'll take those three, and then we'll go to the next round.
Great, thanks. This actually picks up right off that question. If you were magically in charge of running Treasury's issuance strategy, and the target's, whatever, 3%, what would you do? Maybe it's for Mama Katie. She was handing out free advice earlier. Thanks.
Okay. Who wants to go first? Mama Katie. Go for it.
So On Andrea's question, so I hear what you're saying. There's this sort of like theory out there that when you have a big debt pile, you benefit from inflation being higher. And the mechanism for that, in terms of just the numbers, let's leave the rest. The mechanism for that would be that you have the debt stock is, let's say, in trillion rand, it's whatever the number is. And if you have higher inflation, your revenue line is going to be growing faster. And so over time, your ability to service that debt would be improved by virtue of the fact that your revenues are indexed to inflation. So let's leave the percent of GDP, but in the practicalities in the cash flow space. And therefore, over time, the ability of the state to service that debt would improve because your nominal GDP, which is at the end of the day, the denominator would be growing faster. Two problems with that. The one is that if your inflation is set higher, what it does, it resets your cost of funding across the whole curve. So the cost of funding reflects that. Only in T+1, so when inflation is surprisingly high, the market does not anticipate it for that year, will it actually erode in real terms, your debt burden. After that, the market knows what your debt burden is, it resets your curve, and so you pay more for that debt, so that every incremental year, your debt service costs just increase by a bigger margin, which is actually what we have seen. So that mechanism does not work, except in the very, very short term. So if you look at our debt portfolio as it sits, we have 25% of the total bonds are inflation-linked. So if you reduce inflation, it will reduce the debt burden in real terms from that perspective. We refinance every year 20% of our debt. So if we reset the cost of funding by 1.5 percentage points, so at the front end, say it's like 8%, instead of us paying 8%, we pay 6.5%, it would lower the debt service cost quite quickly because we're rolling over the debt. And that is the other problem with that kind of math where you say, well, inflation will erode the debt. When you're refinancing a big portion of the debt and you're issuing it all short, which you will do at higher inflation, it just means that the cost of funding just resets very, very quickly. So that benefit erodes very, very quickly. And now you talk about the fact that there's a real increase in debt of 6 percentage points. What Treasury does not do right now is they don't show you the full indexation over the life of a CPI-linked bond. In fact, if you add the CPI linkers and you index them to inflation at 4.5, our debt does not peak at 77. It peaks closer to 80%. So that's already in the number. So in fact, if you lower inflation, your debt peak is going to come down. So it's not true that you can somehow magically inflate your way out of debt when you have an open system, an open capital account system where people can allocate how they want. All that will happen is they'll take that thing out. So that needs to be solidly, people need to be disabused of this idea that you can inflate your way out of debt. You can't.
Andrea? You guys feel free to respond to any of the questions. You don't have to respond to all of them. Just pick and choose which one you want to deal with.
On Jave's question, I think closing out that inflation differential and doing something about the embedded structural depreciation in the rand, that's one of the benefits that we're talking about. That's what we, I suppose, indirectly trying to achieve. On Andreas's question, so I'm not as familiar with the market microstructure as Andreas may be, or even admittedly as Mamokete may be. I like to think of it in a debt dynamics kind of setup. First of all, it's not obvious to me that the primary balance is going to be wider under a lower inflation target, given the inflation-linked part of the expenditure basket against what is already a very low GDP deflator. So maybe primary balance will be slightly wider, maybe not. And then within the R minus G component, the point is that R comes down, not goes up. And then within the snowball term or the other component, you look at what's driving that at each budget cycle, it's currency depreciation and inflation adjustment. So you can do something about the snowball term as well. And in that way, in that framework at least, it's not obvious to me that a lower target raises the debt level. But maybe I'm wrong, right? I don't know the market microstructure in the detail that you have it along the points of the curve. So I'm happy to be taught a lesson on this. On Dave's side, what would I do? I mean, Treasury is well within its prudential guidelines on the structure of the debt basket, of the debt portfolio. I think there is scope to shorten the duration and do everything that they can to effectively lower the effective cost of debt. So whether that means more T-bills, or whether that means more FRNs, or just issuing closer to the belly rather than the ultras. But I think there's enough scope when you look at those prudential guidelines on the structure of the portfolio and its duration. I think there's scope for that to come in.
Great. Thanks, Andrea.
Maybe to touch very tangentially on Andrea's question. And my coverage universe is full of contrary examples. Countries that go all out with inflation, and even they don't manage to quite successfully inflate away their debt. So I take the point you're making about try to control the real cost. But is South Africa at risk of any meaningful risk of having too low a rate of inflation? It's not Japan. It doesn't have China-type characteristics. I think we need to accept that there will be some inflation, but the benefits overall to the fiscal financing framework of a lower inflation rate really outweigh the likely costs from much higher inflation. To Mamoketa's point, I think we've got to look at how the entire curve, the front end as well as the long end, would react to inflation staying persistently high. I think there is some expectation on the part of investors, even now, that South African inflation will trend down over time. And if there were any move away from eventually lowering the inflation target, whether that stays in place is an open question. To JF's question on could it be explained better in terms of the benefits of currency stability, potentially yes, but the problem is people's lived experience. Even though inflation targeting has been around in South Africa for 25 years now, the average South African will say our currency is still subject to a great deal of volatility. They're less aware of the recent improvement and the reduction in overall volatility. They're not really looking at this in a sufficiently long-term way. So it can be a compelling argument, but I think it might have to be explained and explained and explained again until people finally get over their earlier experiences of currency volatility and make the connection between lower inflation and a more stable exchange rate.
And I think also, Jeff, there is quite a few people in this political economy who actually think a weaker rand is better for the economy. So those guys are still not going to be convinced.
Great. Let's take another round of questions. Those are great answers. There was somebody else there, but that's fine. Let's start. Let's start way in the back, please, and then we'll go to Guangling, and then Monique and Constantine. Take those four. I think that'll be it, though.
Morning. I'm a multi-asset investor, and I want to essentially re-ask Andrea's question slightly differently. I mean, there is a debt stock with a maturity profile priced for expected inflation in the order of 6%. Repricing that to 4% is a real wealth transfer to the bondholder. It doesn't surprise me that fixed income investors on average like the idea of lower inflation targets. But Andrea's point about a fiscal or political economy that doesn't support a gradual reduction in inflation. Can we achieve a sustainably lower inflation target without a political economy or a fiscal policy support? That's the question.
Okay. Who is next? Guangling?
Thank you. I don't have questions. I just want to make a few comments.
I'd rather you do a question.
I think you have
Pose
some,
it as a question.
having some flexibility would be optimal to me. And then secondly, I think we have to calculate the cost of reducing inflation, perhaps not sacrifice ratio, as we know the employment rate, issue in this country is very unique, perhaps not sensitive to inflation. Secondly, we all know inflation is counter-cyclical, so output perhaps is not a good measurement either. The way that I can think would be the physical side, right? So if you think about recently, the US mentioned the Fed made a huge loss due to high interest rate. The Fed doesn't mean to be there to make profits. So if we are going to reduce the inflation, we have to investigate this cost. If there's no cost, then why would we still spend time here to talk about this, right? Let's just do it. So we have to do some investigation before we decide to and when and how to implement this reducing inflation. Yeah, that's just my comment.
Thanks, Monique. Monique?
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the question of how to transition to the new target and whether the staggered suggestion or a not so deliberate staging of it makes sense, right? So I'd like you to reflect on the fact that often we talk about the markets first, and is that the only group that we should be focusing on? And how does that affect our choice as well? So if we choose an approach that is staggered down, are the other groups even going to, be paying attention to that sufficiently quickly for it to make any difference? And does it limit our opportunities to take advantage of any opportunistic yes, exactly. So if you now have it at 4 and you actually go a bit lower, are we going to correct back up again? And then, how is this actually going to work? And which group of people should we really care about? Is it just the markets? And then secondly, this idea of giving tangible communication is really great. And of course, we know it must matter. But I think that little calculation that Andrea suggested is actually fantastic, because it's harder to do, to think of these tangible ideas than to hypothesize about them. And what we find in the media, when you look at the media articles and they're actually talking about us, they often do those calculations right. The the repo rate went down this much. How much does that mean for a 100,000 Rand house or whatever? They do exactly those simple calculations. So I think that's fantastic.
Constantine, that'll be the last question. We've got 5 minutes left to answer.
Thanks. One question and one comment. There has been a lot of focus on the impact of inflation on the poor. What is the likely impact of lower inflation on the profitability of the financial sector? So that's my question. And my comment, I agree with Andrea on the thing of kind of the need to do more work. But I think we must also be aware that there is no formula that we can come up that is going to give us the precise answer that the target should be 3.21 or 2.75. Unfortunately, it's an area like the sacrifice ratio that we need to use. Look at other things. What are the inflation targets in other countries? And so there are some limitations in terms of the amount of analytical work that we can do to get a sense of the precise target. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to talk the book of the financial sector? None of you. High inflation's a great thing.
Yeah,
right?
I'll take a stab. Let me just tackle the question about financial sector, if that's the only group that we need to be worrying about. So I'd like to say, firstly, we're all financial services people here, so we don't know, we can't represent anyone else. That's our happy place. It's our natural vantage point, is one from our financial markets perspective. But I also think, to the extent that there are benefits to lowering the inflation target, the sector that will probably process them the quickest and manifest them the quickest is the financial services sector, because it affects pricing, it affects yields, it affects dollar rand, etc. So we're not the only ones that are going to be affected by the change, no doubt, but we are the sector that will deliver the benefits the quickest of a policy change of that nature. So I suppose that's why we fixate on it. As you were talking, I actually started to think about Eleanor's idea that we move gradually as opposed to fast. So maybe that takes into account the fact that it's not just bankers that are economic agents in the system. So maybe that's also quite fair. And you know, on the follow-up to Andrea's question, the lady asked, can we have a political system that does not have fiscal support? So that fiscal support transfers, etc. You know, and the implication from what you're saying is that somehow higher inflation supports our ability to do that. I think I'll speak for you know, the governor who always says inflation does not benefit the poor. So at the end of the day, the poor person's experience of you know, the transfer is real, because if inflation is high, it erodes you know, the benefit of whatever transfer it is that you're giving them. If you look at what's happened with the current budget debate, one of the things that Treasury has had to go back and reduce from its allocation was actually inflation adjustment to grants and social support. And that means going forward, the real benefit of the transfer for poor households is going to be lower because there's no inflation adjustment. If inflation had been lower, that erosion would have been lower as well. So I suppose what I'm saying is higher inflation, especially we're talking 150 basis points here, is not necessary for the state to be able to you know, support poor households. So I don't know how that features in terms of that.
Maybe just in terms of Monique's point, I don't think it's entirely fair to say that we focused only on the financial sector. Margit is very right that we'll reflect it first and respond first. But a lot of this conversation was precisely about, and I've made the point repeatedly, that you know, this has to be sold at some level to politicians as well. And we have considered the impact on different households, and it's ultimately the business sector needs to buy into this as well. So definitely not, we are considering all of the agents that are involved.
Andrea?
So I think I can put a set of comments together that maybe addresses or touches on all three maybe. So I do think you do need the political economy behind this. I think it becomes very difficult to achieve, like I said, 3% for argument's sake, if that's the number. It becomes difficult to achieve that without some help from that administered price component. Administered prices averaging 6.5% for the last 5 years means that the private sector inflation rate needs to be way below 3, somewhere like 2.5, 2.8, which, if you speak to corporates, is a problem. Why? Because the inflation that corporates don't face is the consumer basket, the CPI. No, that's not relevant for them. The inflation that the corporates, or the cost base that the corporate sector faces, municipal prices, water, electricity, and labor, those are not running at 6.5. Those are running a little bit higher. And so if you could get a little bit of support by government sector inflation coming down, it takes that pressure off the corporate sector to perpetually run very low, almost abnormal rates of inflation. So I think you do need the political economy backdrop from that. Constantine, 100% right on the difficulty in coming up with a point target. That's why I really try to get across this point that we know that it's the optimal rate's not 4.5. But I think we have a good idea of the range. So maybe it'll be a political discussion as to what is an acceptable compromise, but it's certainly lower than 4.5. I think we can all agree on that.
So
Rosie,
touching
the
very
last
quickly,
word.
30 seconds is going to be the attempt on those 3 questions. The way I understood the fiscal question was, do you need a great deal more fiscal credibility for a lower inflation target to actually be understood and for it to be credible in its own right? I think we all know the answer to that question. It would certainly help not to have this overhang of the debt. We wouldn't get questions of, wouldn't South Africa be better off with a higher rate of inflation to inflate it all away if debt dynamics were different? The second question was around the financial sector, and in the transition to a lower target, net interest margins initially would do well, but once you start achieving much lower inflation on an ongoing basis, maybe the financial sector will have to rethink what it relies on. Actual maturity transformation, actual intermediation, doing something more transformative, no bad thing. Third point, to Constantine's question on the optimal target and should we be thinking of a band. If I look back at South Africa's history, I think in the initial days of the inflation target, there was too much emphasis on there being a band, and we all understood it incorrectly as a consequence. It's very difficult to do away with that, to go for a point target now because of the danger that an actual point target is missed. But I would say to the SARB, in the communication, really up the level of communication on that point target, accepting that if there is a band, that's the second best option. 3% is no bad number. Thank you.
There's absolutely no way I can improve on all of those answers. That was fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Okay.
Thank you for the moderating.